Kidney failure, public riots, government-sponsored snitching, and one of the most disturbing child murders in English history. That is the legacy of gin. Today, it sits in a pretty bottle behind every cocktail bar on the planet, and bartenders in Brooklyn argue about the proper ratio of botanicals for a perfect Negroni. At least, that's the version of gin you know. But this story doesn't start with a cocktail shaker. It starts with a doctor, a jar of juniper berries, and a desperate attempt to cure kidney stones in the Dutch Republic. The year was 1572, and a physician named Franciscus Sylvius was working at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. Sylvius was experimenting with juniper berries, distilling them into a concentrated spirit he called Jenever, from the Dutch word for juniper. The idea was medicinal. Juniper had been used in folk remedies across Europe for centuries, and Sylvius believed a distilled version could treat kidney ailments and stomach problems more effectively than the crude herbal pastes doctors had been smearing on patients for generations. And honestly, by the standards of 16th century medicine, it wasn't the worst idea anyone ever had. This was an era when doctors still believed disease was caused by bad smells, prescribed bloodletting for basically everything, and thought the planets influenced your bowel movements. A warm juniper spirit that made your patient feel better, even temporarily, was practically cutting-edge science. Now, there's actually some debate among historians about whether Sylvius truly invented Jenever or whether he was simply the first to document and formalize a recipe that Dutch and Flemish monks had been tinkering with for decades. Juniper-based tonics show up in records as far back as the 1300s in the Low Countries. But what Sylvius did was give the drink legitimacy. He put a university seal on it, essentially. And that mattered. Jenever caught on fast. Dutch pharmacies began selling it as a medicinal tonic, and people quickly discovered that this so-called medicine also happened to taste pretty good and made you feel warm on a cold Amsterdam evening. Within a few decades, Jenever had jumped from the apothecary shelf to the tavern counter. The Dutch were drinking it socially, recreationally, and in quantities that had absolutely nothing to do with kidney health. By the late 1600s, Jenever distilleries were a booming industry in cities like Schiedam, which, at its peak, had nearly 400 distilleries crammed into a town with a population of barely 10,000 people. Then came the war. During the 80 Years' War, and later the 30 Years' War, English soldiers, fighting alongside the Dutch, noticed something interesting. Before heading into battle, Dutch troops would take swigs of Jenever to calm their nerves. The English called this practice Dutch courage, a phrase we still use today. And those English soldiers brought a taste for the spirit back home, across the channel with them. This detail, English soldiers carrying a foreign drinking habit back to their home country, would come back to haunt an entire nation. But that's getting ahead of the story. For a while, Jenever was just another imported curiosity in England, a niche drink, nothing to worry about. That didn't last. In 1689, everything changed. William of Orange, a Dutchman, took the English throne alongside his wife Mary in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. William brought his Dutch tastes with him, and he brought something even more consequential. He brought Dutch trade policy. William's government passed a series of laws that made it incredibly easy and incredibly cheap to distill grain spirits in England. The most important of these was the Distilling Act of 1690, which essentially allowed anyone to start distilling without a license, as long as they used English grain. The logic was economic. England had a grain surplus, and William wanted to undercut French brandy imports because, well, England and France hated each other. So the government basically said, go ahead, distill whatever you want, and we'll barely tax you for it. I mean, think about that for a second. The government of England just handed an entire population a license to make hard liquor in their kitchens, with almost no regulation and almost no taxes. You can probably guess what happened next. London exploded with gin production. By the early 1700s, the city had over 7,000 gin shops. For context, London had fewer churches and chapels combined. You could buy gin on practically every street corner. It was sold in barbershops, in groceries, in wheelbarrow carts on the sidewalk. Some landlords even paid their workers partially in gin instead of wages. And the gin itself was nothing like what you'd find in a bar today. This was crude, unregulated, often dangerous stuff. Distillers flavored it with turpentine, sulfuric acid, and sawdust. Some of them added sugar of lead, which is exactly as toxic as it sounds. The drink went by street names like Madam Jenever, Strip Me Naked, and Cuckold's Comfort. The poorest neighborhoods in London were hit hardest. In the slums of Street, Giles, and Cheapside, families spent what little money they had on gin instead of food or rent. Mothers gave gin to their infants to keep them quiet. Workers drank before, during, and after their shifts. The death rate in London actually exceeded the birth rate during the worst years of the gin craze, meaning the city was literally shrinking in population. Street scenes in certain parts of London looked like something out of a disaster film, with men, women, and children lying drunk in gutters at all hours of the day. Magistrates documented cases of people drinking themselves to death in a single sitting. Coroners reported bodies found with gin still clutched in their hands. One gin shop in Southwark reportedly advertised, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2p, clean straw for nothing," offering customers a bed of straw in the cellar to sleep off their binge before staggering back upstairs for more. By 1730, Londoners were consuming roughly 14 gallons of gin per person per year, and that's the average, which means plenty of people were drinking far, far more than that. And somehow, it gets worse. In 1734, a woman named Judith Dufour collected her 2-year-old child from the workhouse where the infant had just been given a brand new set of clothes. Dufour strangled the child, stripped the body, sold the tiny clothes for 1 shilling and 4p, and used the money to buy gin. The case horrified London and became a turning point in how the public viewed the gin epidemic. This was no longer just a nuisance or a moral failing. People started treating it as a national emergency. Around the same time, the artist William Hogarth published his famous print, Gin Lane, which depicted a nightmarish vision of London consumed by gin. In the image, a drunk mother drops her baby over a staircase railing. A man gnaws on a bone alongside a dog. Buildings crumble. A corpse is lowered into a coffin. Hogarth created the print as propaganda, a companion piece to his more cheerful Beer Street, which showed a prosperous, orderly London powered by good English beer. The message was clear. Gin was destroying the country. Parliament agreed and decided to act. But their solution was, to put it politely, a disaster. Between 1729 and 1751, the British government passed 5 separate gin acts trying to get the crisis under control. The first few were almost comically bad. The Gin Act of 1736 imposed heavy taxes on gin sellers and required expensive licenses. To enforce it, the government created an informer system where citizens could report unlicensed gin sellers and receive a cash reward of £5 for each successful conviction. You'd think people would have cooperated. They did not. London's working class saw the informers as traitors, and the backlash was violent. Informers were beaten, stoned, and in at least 2 documented cases, killed by angry mobs. One informer was dragged through the streets and thrown into a pond until he drowned. The gin sellers simply went underground, selling their product under fake names and through elaborate schemes. One famous device was the Puss and Mew machine, a wooden cat mounted on a wall. You'd whisper "Puss" to the cat, slide coins into a slot, and gin would pour out of a tube hidden under the cat's paw. It was basically the world's first vending machine, and it was built entirely to dodge the law. The government repealed the 1736 Act within 2 years. It was unenforceable, and it was getting people killed. The 1737 Act that replaced it was barely any better. Riots broke out across London. Gin sellers simply renamed their product, calling it Parliamentary Brandy or Ladies' Delight to dodge the letter of the law. Hardly anyone ever hears about this part. The early gin acts are treated as a footnote in most history books, but they're a perfect example of what happens when a government tries to ban something people desperately want. The product doesn't disappear. It just goes underground, gets more dangerous, and the people who sell it get more creative. And if that pattern sounds familiar, it should, because the exact same thing was about to happen again 200 years later on the other side of the Atlantic. It took until 1751 for Parliament to finally pass a gin act that actually worked. The key difference was strategy. Instead of trying to ban gin outright or tax it into oblivion, the 1751 Act focused on regulating who could sell it. It banned distillers from selling directly to the public, required retailers to operate from licensed premises, and gave magistrates the power to oversee the trade. It was less dramatic than the earlier acts, but it actually reduced consumption. Gin drinking in London dropped significantly over the following decade. The gin crisis was over, but gin itself was far from dead. Over the next century, gin reinvented itself. The crude, turpentine-laced gutter spirit of the gin craze gave way to something cleaner and more refined. By the early 1800s, distillers in London had developed a new style called London Dry Gin, which used a cleaner distillation process and relied on botanicals like coriander, angelica root, and citrus peel alongside the traditional juniper. Gin went from the drink of the desperate poor to the drink of the British officer class. And it was in the far corners of the British Empire that gin found its most famous pairing. In colonial India, during the 1830s, British soldiers and administrators faced a serious problem with malaria. The best prevention available was quinine, a bitter compound derived from the bark of the cinchona tree. Quinine worked, but it tasted absolutely terrible. So, the British started dissolving quinine powder in carbonated water, creating what they called tonic water. But even tonic water was hard to choke down on its own. So someone, and history doesn't record exactly who, had the bright idea to mix the tonic with gin, a squeeze of lime, and a bit of sugar. The gin and tonic was born, not in a cocktail bar, not as a luxury drink, as a malaria prevention strategy, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, probably both. The gin and tonic spread across the British Empire and eventually back to England, where it became a staple of upper-class social life. British officers in Bombay and Calcutta sipped gin and tonics on their verandas at sunset, and the drink became so associated with colonial life that it practically functioned as a symbol of the empire itself. Winston Churchill would later say that gin and tonic had saved more English lives and minds than all the doctors in the empire. And while that's obviously an exaggeration, it gives you a sense of how central the drink had become. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy had already established its own relationship with gin. Officers received a gin ration while enlisted sailors got rum, creating a class divide that was literally measured in spirits. The expression Dutch courage had long since lost its original meaning, and gin was now thoroughly, unmistakably British. Gin had completed an almost unbelievable transformation, from a cheap medicine to a street drug that nearly destroyed London to the refined drink of empire. If gin had stopped there, this would be a very different story. But across the Atlantic Ocean, gin was about to have its wildest chapter yet. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect, and the Volstead Act that enforced it made the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages illegal across the entire country. America had entered Prohibition. Now, banning alcohol in a country that really liked drinking was always going to create problems, and gin, of all spirits, was uniquely positioned to thrive in a black market. Unlike whiskey, which requires years of barrel aging, or beer, which requires specialized brewing equipment, gin can be made quickly and with minimal tools. All you need is a neutral grain spirit, some juniper berries and other botanicals, and a vessel to mix them in. Enter Bathtub Gin. The name was literal. Americans across the country began producing homemade gin in their bathtubs, kitchen sinks, and basement stills. The process was simple but crude. You take industrial grain alcohol, sometimes denatured alcohol meant for cleaning products, dilute it with water, and add juniper oil or juniper berries, along with whatever other flavorings you could get your hands on. The reason people used bathtubs specifically was practical. The tall glass bottles used for mixing the gin were too tall to fit under a standard sink faucet, but they fit perfectly under a bathtub tap. The quality ranged from tolerable to genuinely poisonous. Some bathtub gin was just harsh and unpleasant. Other batches, especially those made from denatured industrial alcohol, contained methanol, which could cause blindness, organ failure, and death. The federal government had actually ordered manufacturers to add toxic chemicals to industrial alcohol, specifically to discourage people from drinking it. When people drank it anyway, the government's response was essentially a shrug. An estimated 10,000 Americans died from poisoned alcohol during Prohibition, and no, I'm not making that up. But the demand for gin, and alcohol in general, didn't slow down. If anything, Prohibition made drinking more popular. Speakeasies, the secret bars hidden behind fake storefronts and unmarked doors, popped up in every American city. New York City alone had an estimated 30,000 speakeasies by the late 1920s, which was roughly double the number of legal bars the city had before Prohibition started. Gin became the spirit of choice in speakeasies for a simple reason. Because bathtub gin tasted so rough, bartenders had to get creative with cocktails to mask the flavor. They mixed gin with fruit juices, bitters, vermouths, and syrups. The result was an explosion of cocktail culture. Many of the classic cocktails we still drink today, including the bee's knees, the South Side, and the French 75, were invented during Prohibition specifically to make bad gin drinkable. Gin was also uniquely popular with women during Prohibition. Before the 1920s, drinking culture in America was almost exclusively male. Saloons didn't welcome women, and social norms kept most women away from hard liquor. But speakeasies were different. They were co-ed by design, partly because mixed crowds drew less suspicion from police. And the sweet, fruity cocktails that bartenders invented to hide the taste of bad gin appealed to people who'd never had a straight shot of whiskey. Prohibition, completely by accident, created the first generation of American women who drank publicly and socially. So Prohibition, which was supposed to make America sober, accidentally turned America into a nation of cocktail enthusiasts and demolished a century of gendered drinking norms. That's the kind of irony you really can't script. Prohibition ended on December 5, 1933, when the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th. Americans celebrated in the streets and legal distilleries fired back up. But gin's reputation had taken a beating. For decades after Prohibition, gin carried the stigma of the bathtub era. It was your grandfather's drink, outdated, harsh, something you mixed with tonic and didn't think too much about. That perception held for most of the 20th century. Vodka overtook gin as the fashionable clear spirit in the 1960s and 70s, helped along by the James Bond franchise and its famous martini. Gin seemed like it might fade into history, a relic of colonial verandas and Prohibition-era desperation. Then something unexpected happened. In 1999, a Scottish brand called Hendrick's launched a gin infused with cucumber and rose petals, and it sold like crazy. It proved that gin didn't have to taste like your grandfather's London Dry. It could be something new, something interesting. That bottle cracked open a door, and over the next 2 decades, an entire industry walked through it. Starting in the late 2000s and accelerating through the 2010s, craft distilleries began popping up across Britain, the United States, Japan, Australia, and eventually the rest of the world. These small batch producers experimented with new botanicals, new distillation methods, and new flavor profiles that had nothing to do with the traditional London Dry style. Suddenly, you could buy gins infused with everything from lavender and blood orange to seaweed and ant larvae. Yes, ant larvae. There's a gin for that. The Spanish started serving gin and tonics in enormous balloon glasses with elaborate garnishes, turning a simple 2-ingredient drink into a theatrical experience. The trend spread across Europe and beyond. Today, there are more than 6,000 gin brands available worldwide. The global gin market generates billions of dollars in revenue annually. Gin bars and gin tasting experiences have become fixtures in cities from London to Tokyo to Melbourne. The spirit that started as a kidney remedy in a Dutch laboratory has become one of the most versatile and celebrated drinks on the planet. Franciscus Sylvius mixed juniper berries into a spirit to cure kidney stones. 4.5 centuries later, people pay $20 for a single glass of his invention, garnished with a sprig of rosemary and a grapefruit twist. He probably would have wanted royalties. If you want to see how another everyday product has a history this wild, click the video on screen now. And if you made it to the end, subscribe. There's more where this came from.